It is a privilege and an honor to be here. So I'm deeply grateful for the invitation. I hope that you enjoy the presentation. I do not claim to have an answer to this difficult question, but the idea is to think a little bit about the variety of options that are out there. Besides thinking about this question, I would like you to begin thinking about two other questions. And I would like you to have these questions throughout the lecture in your mind somehow. The question number one is how do we understand all the different answers to this question? Why did the Buddha attain parinibbana? There are different ways of thinking about the variety of answers. You are going to get a handout in which I explain what I'm planning to do in this lecture, so maybe we will just 1 minute until everybody has a copy. I would like to have a copy as well. The first question is how to understand the diverse interpretations of the Buddha parinibbana. And here you have 4 options that I would like you to think about. The first option, the first answer, is to believe that only one interpretation is correct, is true, and therefore all the others are false. This is a common way of thinking based on a binary logic. That is not the only possible way of thinking, so I would like you to consider other alternative ways of thinking. The second one is the one that claims basically that yes, there is one interpretation that is perfectly true, while others are true to some extent or less perfectly true. The third way of thinking would be something like there are many different interpretations that are true from some people, from a certain perspective, or to some extent. And finally, another way of thinking about all these possible answers would be the idea that all the different interpretations are somehow equally valid. There is no way to tell which one is better, worse, which one is true, which one is not false. Maybe thinking about what is true and what is false is unhelpful, or maybe it's not the right way of thinking about this type of literature. So you have these 4 ways of thinking. So I would like you to begin thinking about which one do you find more acceptable. And the other question I would like you to think about is, okay, once we analyze different interpretations of the parinibbana of the Buddha, is, okay, what about today, in the 21st century, in our specific cultural context? What's the best way to make the Buddha's parinibbana relevant, to make it significant? What values, what virtues, what qualities can we see in the deeds of the Buddha, including his parinibbana? So that's another question that I would like to address at the end of the lecture. So let's go to the different answers to the question of why did the Buddha attain parinibbana. I have divided the different answers into 3 categories. The first category is historical critical interpretations or historical critical explanations. Then traditional explanations, by that I mean the Theravada explanation and the Mahayana explanation. And finally, we will consider some alternative explanations. And the last one of the alternative explanations is that I would defend, right? So it corresponds to my own view. Okay? So just to let you know and to have the outline of the presentation. So the most common explanation for the Buddha's parinibbana is the tendency to blame Ananda, right? Venerable Ananda. And that, of course, is based on the texts. And according to this explanation, it was not the Buddha, it was Ananda who failed to ask the Buddha when the Buddha was giving him hints, when he was trying to prompt Ananda to ask him to live longer, to use his power of concentration, the four paths to power. Another explanation that is also very common is the one that somehow blames the Buddha's last meal. When Chunda, the blacksmith or the metalsmith, offers the Buddha this food with abundance of pig's delight, is the translation of Moorish Walsh, the Sukara Madaba in Pali, this tender pig that, as you may know, there are many articles and many discussions about what exactly was this food, whether or not it was meat or vegetarian dishes. But the most common interpretation nowadays is the one that interprets the compound Sukara Madaba as referring to some mushroom, some vegetables, truffles perhaps, a place in which pigs delight, right? So a place in which pigs like to dwell, and so that's the second historical critical explanation. And the third explanation is the one that tends to blame Mara. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, when Ananda fails to ask the Buddha, there is a reference to Mara's influence in Ananda's mind, right? So if this is the case, then it wouldn't be Ananda, it would be Mara that is behind the Buddha's decision to renounce the life principle and attain parinibbana after the lapse of 3 months. Another people interpret the conversation between Mara and the Buddha as some sort of promise that the Buddha made to Mara soon after his enlightenment. And Mara somehow reminds the Buddha, look what you said soon after your enlightenment. You said that once you had an established community of disciples, lay disciples, monastic disciples, accomplished and able to protect and preserve the Dhamma, you would somehow attain parinibbana. So now you have these disciples, so why don't you attain parinibbana? The Buddha, of course, he replies, he uses the expression aposukko, right? Which Walsh translates it as do not worry. But I believe that it is a little stronger what the Buddha says, right? Because there is an imperative tone, right? The Buddha uses the imperative of bhavati, right? Hohi. So the combination of the imperative and this aposukko, right? I think is best translated as something like relax or take it easy, right? So dismissive, right? So it's not that the Buddha is being persuaded by Mara, but rather that Mara says, leave me alone, I'm going to attain parinibbana 3 months from now. So relax. So I have a quote in which we see how Mara is considered the main factor the main reason for the Buddha's parinibbana. I'm going to read this quote. You can see the reference. It is from Bhikkhu Nyanaponika Thera and Helmut Hecker, and it says as follows: if Mara had not intervened, Ananda would have asked the Buddha to accept the burden of a prolonged life, and the Buddha would have consented out of compassion for the world. But Mara, afraid that innumerable beings would have thereby escaped his clutch, hastened to prevent this, and the course of history was sealed. And then the conclusion of the quote, which I find it especially relevant. This sin, so poignant and suggestive, belongs to the mysteries of the Pali Canon, and one could puzzle about it endlessly. So even though he blames Ananda, he also recognizes that this is a puzzle, that this is a mystery, right? So but just to point out that this interpretation is still quite common. Now, I think there is a need to change these traditional explanations and to move on and to begin to stop blaming Ananda, Chunda, and Mara. Because once you investigate further and read the texts and the commentaries, you see that it is not fair to blame these figures, and the commentaries specifically reject the idea that it is because of Mara or if it is because of Ananda. So it is time to begin, with quotation marks, blaming the Buddha or making the Buddha take responsibility. I'm saying this with the utmost respect, of course, so please don't mind if I speak in this way. But the question is why? Okay, the Buddha is the one that took the decision, so we need to investigate why. And here we have two conflicting understandings of the Buddha and his parinibbana. The first one, the Mahayana explanation, basically does not believe in the historicity of the Buddha's parinibbana. The Buddha's parinibbana was not a historical event, it was an appearance. It was not the real Buddha that attained parinibbana. In the handout, if you take a look at the first text, this is a quote from the Lotus Sutra, and this is a translation from the Chinese. I got it from the library, so it is available in case you would like to check it out. So you can read the quote. Let me read it for you. Since sentient beings have various natures, desires, behaviors, thoughts, and distinctions, the Tathagata, wanting to make them plant roots of good merit, has explained various teachings through a variety of examples, explanations, and illustrations. He has not desisted from doing Buddha's acts, even for a single moment, and in this way it has been an extremely long time since I attained Buddhahood. My lifespan is immeasurable and incalculable. I abide forever without entering parinibbana. Although I do not actually enter parinibbana, I proclaim I do. It is through these skillful means, upaya, that the Tathagata leads and it inspires sentient beings. Since I became a Buddha, immeasurable, limitless, hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis of nayutas of incalculable kalpas have passed. Though for the sake of sentient beings, I use skillful means and say that I will enter parinibbana, there is no one who could rightly say that I am guilty of falsehood. End of the quote. So, summarizing this view, it is not the Buddha himself or the real Buddha or the true body of the Buddha, but rather an emanation, the nirmanakaya, that appears to die. And the reason why is because the early disciples otherwise would have experienced attachment or not the need to practice with diligence. So for the well-being and happiness of the early disciples, it was best to attain parinibbana so that they would practice with more intensity, right? If they know that the master is going to leave, then they have more motivation to practice harder, right? But if they believe that it's not going to attain parinibbana, then they may become lazy and think, okay, the master is always around, so why should I practice, right? So it's out of compassion, out of skillful means that the Buddha appears to attain parinibbana. Now, the Theravada explanation is different, of course, thank you. It is a historical event, a unique historical event, and it has to do with the meditative attainment called parasamapati, right? The Buddha decides to attain this fruition attainment is called in order to live 3 months. Remember that the Buddha was very sick after the rainy season. He experienced these sharp pains to the point that he thinks that he's about to die, and then he decides to apply to make a resolution and apply the mind to the Jivita Samkara, right? And he does that through the fruition attainment. And the same meditative state appears also when the Buddha decides to renounce the life principle, Ayu Sankara, right? So he also makes a decision, I'm going to attain this meditative state for 3 months, and then I will attain parinibbana, right? So that's the traditional Theravada explanation. And text 2, let's go to text 2. You have the Pali that I don't dare to read in front of so many experts. So I will read the English instead. So, text 2. He, mindful and comprehending, dismissed his life impetus. I translate it as life principle, but it's the same term, Ayusankara. Having established mindfulness and having delimited the time with knowledge, he released and gave up his life impetus. In the text, the Blessed One renounced his life impetus, not in the way one throws away a stone, a club, with one's hand. Rather, he thought, I will attain the attainment, samapati, for the 3 months only, and from then on, I will not attain anymore. This is the translation. Referring to that, it is said, he renounced. Usaji is another reading for Osaji. Okay, so the reference is there. So this is the first part of the Theravada explanation, and then there is a second part. So, why did the Buddha decide to attain this fruition attainment for just 3 months? So this is the second part. The reason is because Buddhas remain alive as long as there are people who can be trained, taught, guided. The Buddha had already accomplished his mission to establish a flourishing community of disciples, and he knew that after 3 months there wouldn't be anybody else to train. So you can see the text number 3, a little longer. I'm not going to read it, so you can see that what I said is based on that particular text. And my thanks to Professor Alex Ruiz Falquez for editing the Pali. So let's compare now the Mahayana and the Theravada explanation. First, we need to notice that both serve a pedagogical purpose. For both of them, the Buddha is doing something that is exemplary, something that is supposed to be a model, a heroic action. Now, in the case of the Theravada, we see that the values, the virtues, the mental qualities that are exemplified are non-attachment, first and foremost, mindfulness, right? Remember that renouncing the life principle is done mindfully and also with clear comprehension, right? With sampajano, sati. In the case of the Mahayana, the main values are skillful means, this upaya, expedient means, and of course compassion, right? Remember, it's for the well-being and the happiness for the early disciples. Now, another interesting contrast between the Mahayana and the Theravada explanation is how early disciples are portrayed. In the case of the Theravada tradition, early disciples are portrayed as already accomplished. They do not need further training, right? That's why the Buddha decides to attain parinibbana for just 3 months. In the case of the Mahayana explanation, is the opposite. They are not fully accomplished, so for their own well-being, so that they may practice with diligence, it is necessary to attain parinibbana. Okay? So very sharp contrast between the way early disciples are understood by Mahayana traditions and Theravada tradition, of course, right? Now, problems. I'm going to point out problems, and I'm trying to be neutral here. I'm not going to favor either the Mahayana or the Theravada. I'm just going to pose some problems that people with critical thinking skills may develop. Okay? So, let's begin with the Mahayana explanation. What problems can we point out? First, what the Buddha becomes. The Buddha becomes some sort of supernatural entity, some sort of quasi-divine figure, a transcendent reality, if you like, who attained enlightenment eons ago and who limit himself to some emanation bodies, nirmanakayas or avatars, if you want to use that terminology, right? So the problem with this interpretation of the Buddha is it becomes difficult to use the Buddha as a role model, right? Because the Buddha is not like us, human beings. He's some different type of reality, but not something that we can emulate, right? Not someone who can be emulated, right? So this is a problem. Maybe some people do not agree with this idea. That's perfectly fine. Maybe some people believe, oh, it is best that the Buddha is neither human, neither divine, is one of a kind, right? Okay. But for ordinary practitioners, it seems problematic to have a master that you cannot emulate, right? It's another problem that we find in the Theravada the Mahayana explanation is, of course, the problem of to what extent it is morally acceptable for the Buddha to say something that is not the case. Now, some people may call this a lie or a white lie, so that's up to you. I'm not going to enter into this evaluation game, but some people would say this is lying and Buddhas cannot lie, so this is not possible, this is not acceptable. But from the Mahayana perspective, there is no deception here. There is no lie. And I think the Mahayana text number 1 explicitly says that. No, but let me repeat again, right? There is no one who would rightly say, I'm guilty of falsehood. Okay, so there is no lie whatsoever here. Skillful means. But still, this is a problem, and some people find this difficult to accept. Okay? Now, let's move on to the Theravada explanation, and let's try to think critically with the utmost respect, of course, but let's see if we can say something meaningful without offending anybody. It's not my intention, of course, so please don't forget that. Now, the main problem, I would say, is the problem of the arbitrary nature of the Buddha's decision, right? The question is, okay, the Buddha decided to attain this Pala Samapati for 3 months, but why not 6 months? Why not 1 year? Why not 2 years? Why not what remains of the eon? And of course, the Theravada response is what we read, because the disciples were already trained and there was nobody else to train. But this explanation, some people might find it weak, because, okay, even if it is true that at the time of the Buddha's parinibbana, there were no disciples in need of training, you cannot say that afterwards there were many other disciples who could have benefited from the Buddha's presence. Or similarly, some people may argue that if the Buddha had decided to stay longer, maybe the Sangha wouldn't have split into different factions, right? So some people find the Theravada explanation unconvincing, right? Now, another problem has to do with the Buddha's change of opinion, and I put question mark at the end. Did the Buddha change his opinion? I mean, what is clear, what the text says is that first, the Buddha is very sick and he makes a resolution. He applies his mind to the Jivita Sankara, right? To the vitality principle. And this happens at Velez. And then afterwards, when Venerable Ananda and the Buddha, when they go to Chapala shrine, then we have the episode about the Buddha trying to prompt Ananda to ask him. And then afterwards, the Buddha decides to renounce the life principle. Right? So, in the first case, the Buddha didn't need anybody to ask him to apply the mind to the Jivita Sankara. So some people may ask, why was it necessary at Chapala shrine that Ananda asked the Buddha, right? If it was not necessary when he was sick, why is it that now became necessary? And if it was not something that depended on the Buddha's will, how come the Buddha at the end decides to renounce the life principle himself, right? So anyway, so this change of opinion with a question mark, and this is what I said before, but even if the Theravada explanation is plausible, one could reply that even if the Buddha immediate disciples did not require further guidance, the Buddha's presence could have benefited many after, or many other people, and it would have prevented schisms. Let's move on now to the third category of explanations, alternative explanations. The first one basically suggests that the Buddha got frustrated with Ananda because Ananda failed to ask him to stay longer, to live, to extend his life. That he somehow got upset, frustrated, and decided, okay, I'm going to attain parinibbana, right? Because I don't get my way, so I get upset and I... Now the problem with this interpretation, of course, is that Buddhas do not behave like that, right? This interpretation is problematic because it projects into the Buddha a conduct that is improper of enlightened beings. Buddhas do not act out of frustration when their wishes are not fulfilled. So it's not a very strong explanation, right? Another alternative explanation would be to suggest that the Buddha abandoned the will to life. The Buddha was, as everybody knows, he was experiencing sharp pain, physical discomfort most of his time, and he had to rely on these meditative attainments to somehow avoid pain, avoid excruciating sharp pains. So eventually he got tired of this and he decided to put an end to his troubles by abandoning the will to life, or to live, I'm sorry. I don't want to live anymore. Enough, I have enough. I'm tired of all this pain and entering into this pala samapati or animitta cetto samadhi, I think is the one that appears in the suttas, right? So I'm tired of relying on these meditative states. Enough is enough. Okay. Problem with this interpretation. I make a distinction between two problems. First, it is not something that Buddhas would do. It seems proper of someone who is unable to cope with discomfort or someone having some degree of craving for non-existence. And of course, Buddhas do not have craving for non-existence. And this explanation also seems to contradict the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which states that the Buddha endured his disease mindfully, clearly comprehended, and without complaining or without being perturbed by the pain. Problem number two, the explanation seems to contradict what the commentary says when it explains that it is not something that can be compared to throwing a stone. So it's not like rejecting, or it's not a positive act, right? It's rather like a knowledge and release, right? So abandoning the will to live sounds like rejecting, like a positive action. So there is a tension, at least, between what the commentary says and this explanation. Now, alternative explanation 3, which is the one that I humbly propose, which is very simple. Sometimes simple explanations are enough, which is basically that the Buddha decided to renounce the life principle because he had reached the end of his life. Okay, so what evidence do I have to come to this conclusion? Of course, what the Mahaparinibbana itself says. So I'm going to read. Ananda, I'm now old, worn out, venerable, one who has traversed life's path, I have reached the term of life, which is 80. And then the famous simile, just as an old cart is made to go by being held together with the straps, so the Tathagata's body is kept going by being strapped up. Now, what I find interesting about this quote is that it takes place at Velez, right? So, let me read. It is interesting to note that the Buddha affirms that he has reached the end of his life at Velez, before he renounced the life principle at Chapala shrine. So I take it as an indication that is the main reason for the Buddha's parinibbana, right? He had reached the end of his time, the end of his life, and that's what he explicitly states. Now, the Buddha says that he has reached the end of his life not only to Ananda at Chapala, in Velez, that's a mistake I think, but also to his disciples at the great forest, the great forest. And here is the quote, again, right, I am in years, my lifespan is determined, now I go from you having made myself my refuge. So the Buddha tells Ananda and his disciples in two different occasions, in two different places, that he has reached the end of his life. So, okay, if let's revise the sequence of events so that we may appreciate the different interpretations better. So first we have the realization that the Buddha has reached the end of his life, and this is something that takes place at Velez. Second, then we have the Buddha's resolution to recover from his illness and stay alive until he can address his disciples and say goodbye properly. Also at Velez. Number three, then we have the Buddha trying to encourage Ananda to ask him to extend his life at Chapala. Four, the Buddha says to Mara that his parinibbana will take place after the lapse of 3 months. Then after that conversation with Mara, the Buddha renounces the life principle. This takes place at Chapala shrine. 6, the Buddha informs first Ananda and subsequently to his disciples that he is going to attain parinibbana. So, I think it is possible to assume that the Buddha's parinibbana was somehow unavoidable, not necessarily a choice. So I quote, again from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, all those things that are dear and pleasant to us must suffer change, separation and alteration. And this is a question, question mark. So how could, this is the Buddha talking to Ananda, right? So just to give you the context. So how could this be possible, Ananda? Whatever is born, become conditioned, is liable to decay. That it should not decay is impossible. Now what is interesting is that the commentary explains that this is referring to the body of the Buddha, to the process of decay of the Buddha's body. Okay. Now the fact that the Buddha declares to have reached the end of his life before renouncing the life principle seems to suggest that we are before an avoidable process. The Buddha's parinibbana was a matter of time given his age and the condition of his body. Conclusions. So if the Buddha had reached the end of his life and his time was up, given his age and the condition of his body, then his decision to renounce the life principle in order to attain parinibbana is best understood as a way of letting nature follow its course. So it's not a decision, it's letting nature follow its course. So that's first conclusion. By deciding to let go of the life principle, the Buddha was letting the residual karmic energy of his body-mind complex fade away gradually until such energy became fully extinct, until its parinibbana. That residual karmic energy lasted for 3 months. The Buddha, I believe, did not renounce the life principle with the intention to live 3 months. Rather, the Buddha renounced the life principle, and as a consequence of that, he saw that his body-mind complex would last 3 months. Or if you would like to follow the sequence of the commentaries, he first established mindfulness, then he saw the limit of his lifespan, and then he released the life principle. But either way, it is not a decision, it's just letting go. Okay, so that's my interpretation of the Buddha's parinibbana. That was my hypothesis, of course. I do not claim that that's the only possible answer. I don't claim that that's the only reasonable explanation, but is one among several possible readings of this important event in the life of the Buddha. Now, let's move on to the question about, okay, so what? Yes, after so many interpretations of the Buddha's parinibbana, what do we do with all this? How can we make the Buddha's parinibbana relevant today for ordinary practitioners? What values, what virtues, what can we learn from the Buddha? Right? So, and here I propose to view the Buddha, specifically his decision to renounce the life principle, as a way of somehow overcoming or resolving a dilemma. And this dilemma is something that many people experience, especially when they are terminally ill or extremely ill or very close to death. Many people experience a dilemma. The first part of the dilemma is to end things as soon as possible, right? The other option of the dilemma is to do whatever it takes to extend one's life as much as possible, right? To give any medical procedures available, any machines, right? So this dilemma, right, between shortening one's life or extending one's life, I believe it is something that we can see in the narrative about the Buddha's parinibbana. So the first part of the dilemma, that's something that perhaps Mara symbolizes. Mara is the one that tells the Buddha, attain parinibbana right away, right before it is time. Right? Please shorten your life, shorten the time you have left. Right? So Mara will be a symbol for the first part of the dilemma. And also in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, we see first the Buddha at Velez, right? Applying the mind to the vitality principle. to the Jivita Samkara, to recover from his illness and to stay alive a little longer. And then also the conversation with Ananda can be seen as another symbol for this dilemma, for this second option of the dilemma, right? Extending life, right? Giving hints to Ananda to stay longer, to live for an eon or for the remaining of an eon. And what is remarkable is that the Buddha eventually solves the dilemma, not by choosing either one of these two options, but just by giving up, by letting go. And this is what I find remarkable and exemplary. So I read, the Buddha resolves the dilemma by renouncing the life principle, that is, by letting nature follow its course peacefully and mindfully. This interpretation exemplifies the Buddha's peaceful acceptance of the time one has left to live, and this is an example for all. We can all learn from the Buddha's acceptance. I have 3 months, and instead of pushing his body further, he decided to stop. Right? Enough is enough. I let go. I release the life principle. So this letting go of any desperate measures to either shortening life or extending it by all possible means, that's what the Buddha's renunciation could signify today. And in that way it would be a great example for all. So that would be all I have to say. Thank you so much for your presence and attention, and I hope that you got something out of my humble contribution. Thank you.